I'm Aaron Sagers, and this is Talking Strange. Hey there, spooky nerds, and welcome to Talking Strange, a paranormal pop culture show with the Den of Geek Network. As always, I am your host, journalist, author, researcher of all things weird, Aaron Sagers, also from 28 Days Haunted on Netflix and Paranormal Caught on Camera on Travel Channel and the Max streaming service. And honestly, I am more than a little bit biased, but I would say during this spooky season, or really any time, both those shows are worth checking out for some real life scares. Okay, on to the episode. So this episode, I speak with director Jerry Rothwell. He is an acclaimed documentary filmmaker whose work includes Deep Water, which was about Donald Crowhurst's 1968 round-the-world yacht race, which sadly ended in tragedy. He also did the film Heavy Load, about developmentally challenged people who start a punk band. He also did Town of Runners, about two Ethiopian girls who aspire to become track athletes, and then Sour Grapes, about the largest wine fraud case in history. So if you're paying attention, I have not mentioned the paranormal once, which is why it is especially notable because he, Jerry Rothwell, is now behind the AppleTV Plus docuseries, The Enfield Poltergeist. In fact, it is a 4-part hybrid docu-series which reinvestigates one of the most famous modern-day hauntings. The case inspired the horror movie The Conjuring 2, and it's actually the basis for an upcoming stage play starring Catherine Tate, who we all know and love from The Office and Doctor Who. So, the Enfield Poltergeist features hundreds of hours of rare audio archive, first-hand witnesses, and then the benefit of 40 years of hindsight. According to the synopsis, the series is an ambitious genre piece that will, like any good detective story, sway the audience between belief and disbelief. The series explores our universal and timeless fascination with the unexplained and the idea of trauma impacting our reality. It's also a notable project because Rothwell reconstructed the Hodgson house in North London, and he has cast actors to portray the real-life people involved in the case. But he also has actors lip-syncing to the actual audio recorded by paranormal investigator Maurice Gross. The series, I've checked it out, the series is a compelling and, quite frankly, creepy look at the story, and all 4 parts drop October 27 on Apple TV+. So let's get to the interview with director Jerry Rothwell. So Jerry, it's a pleasure speaking with you. And right out of the gate, I must say that this material is something that I'm quite fascinated in, but I felt like I knew this story quite a bit. And then watching this docuseries, you really kind of open it up in a whole new way that we haven't seen before. And I was initially just curious about what your awareness was of this case before taking on this project, and why were you attracted to this story?
Sure. So, I mean, I remember this as a teenager. I think I was 15 when, in 1977, when, the front page of the Daily Mirror, which was the UK's biggest selling newspaper, carried this article just a few days after these events had started happening in this house in North London. And I think it's kind of like, it certainly kind of unsettled all my classmates around, the possibility that the world didn't behave as we thought it did. And then it's not been a story that I've returned to much since then. But about 3 years ago, we became aware that there were these 200 hours, 250, I think, hours, some repetition. There were these 200 hours of tape recordings made by Maurice Gross, who was the lead investigator of these phenomena. And what what attracted me to that was, I think most of the docs that I make are about, with that sort of clash between or the tension between, what's out there, the real that we can't quite know, and what's going on in our heads. And for me, this audio was very kind of ambiguous And fairly early on, I thought about what would happen if you reconstructed this house, filled it with this audio, worked with actors to lip sync the actuality, and then kind of brought in kind of firsthand contemporary witnesses as well. And so for me, what fascinated me was, it asks questions about why do we believe what we believe, what's the nature of reality, all of those things that I'm interested in.
Well, let me backtrack with two questions. First off, when you were a teenager and these events were unfolding, again, it's one thing to read about the history of this, it's another to have lived through it. Was this something that you and your mates and even the adults around you, as this story was progressing in the mirror, was this something that you were kind of following with bated breath each day, or looking for updates through the newspaper and the radio as well?
I think people were very aware of it. The media kind of followed it for a couple of weeks, maybe, and then would dip back in and out every now and then. So it's not like there was a kind of constant coverage, but certainly, we were aware of it as something that was unfolding. I'd kind of grown up with, my mum grew up in what she thought was a haunted house, and would tell me these stories about kind of furniture suddenly being moved to surround her bed. And I think as a child, when you kind of grew up with those stories, you're always trying to sift, the truth from the exaggeration, the reality from the imagination. And I guess that was sort of something, I always found those stories quite disturbing. And I guess that was something that drew me to it as well.
Did you believe your mom?
Did I believe my mum? I guess I certainly began as a child believing my mum. Do I believe her now? Like, the problem with all of these stories is what you have is kind of testimony, and with Enfield you have kind of testimony and sound, both of which are sort of notoriously unreliable. But so did I believe my mum? Yeah, I think I did. Do I believe her now? I don't know.
Well, and I see the artwork for Sour Grapes in the background there. And yeah, your other work, in that case, talking about a very intense wine auction market, or athletes from Ethiopia, or people that are mentally challenged, developmentally challenged, that start a punk group and heavy load. How does this fit, in your opinion? Is this on brand for you, or is this a little bit outside of what your career has been dedicated to as a documentarian?
I think it is a kind of real range of subjects that I've covered. I think there is something in common with them, which is about, how do we know what we know, sort of thing. That's a very broad question. For me, it was really different in a production sense, like usually in a documentary, especially if it's something that's unfolding as we're shooting, I'm working with a really small crew, sometimes shooting myself. We're very fluid, just responding to a situation. Whereas this, because we'd embarked on this crazy kind of technique of trying to lip sync, these audio recordings, it had to be hyper planned and was shot kind of like a drama. We had our 8 minutes a day that we had to do, and really kind of going for it in a very different kind of way. So yeah, very, very new experience for me. And also making a series, unfolding a story over that amount of time and that quantity of material was new for me.
Yeah, 4+ hours of this as a docuseries. Was that pretty much planned from the beginning, as opposed to making this a 2-hour documentary?
Yeah, I mean, we did think for a little bit about doing it as a doc, but it seemed easier to fund as a series in some ways, because that's where the interest is at the moment, I think, in factual series, for better or worse. But I also think it allowed us, the thing about a series is you can kind of take these little eddies off into things, and you can kind of explore things, and you can introduce a character who you bring in and then leave, in a way that is harder to do in a feature. Like the arrow of the feature has to be firing pretty directly, towards its conclusion. And then maybe for this story that was appropriate, because, as you say, it's a story that's been told many times before, and one of the strengths of the series, I think, is that it allows you to kind of approach it from lots of different angles.
it almost has this experimental vibe to it because, as you said, this hybrid docuseries, we've previously seen dramatizations and reenactments, but I cannot recall if I've ever seen anything quite like this, where we have actors that are lip syncing to actual audio that is available, hundreds of hours, as you said. And then we're getting the interviews with people that were there. So all just that as a concept really drew me in immediately. As a filmmaker, you're kind of stretching these new or flexing these new muscles. I would assume that is a new challenge for you.
Sure. Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, even working with actors is not something I've done for a long time. Uh, for me, what was exciting about that is I don't see these as like just normal kind of recreations that you do because you don't have any video footage. For me, there was something about the fact that the audio of the series is kind of authentic, and the pictures of these kind of layered interpretations on top of it. I really like that side of it. It's almost like the actors are kind of haunted by these tapes in some way. It's not, there's something very strange about it, which I don't think we knew would work when we started. And it's interesting, I think, with an audience that there are times in the series where you forget that these are actual audio, actual audio tapes from the, actual documentary audio tapes. And then at times you're pulled back into that, hopefully that was the method we tried to do.
Yeah, talk a little bit about the set, because it seems like you rebuilt this house, this Enfield house from North London, and talk about the construction of the set and why that ended up being beneficial for you to kind of bringing this story to life. I mean, and full disclosure, I read in another interview where you were talking a little bit about that kind of gave you a sense of place and how the audio might kind of lay out throughout the house. But speak to that a little bit more.
Yeah. So, Maurice was this very precise engineering brain, and one of the first things he did was create this measured plan of the house, which I can share with your listeners if you have a website. But creating little kind of measurements and where the furniture was, and the size of the rooms, and sometimes where things happened. It was sort of part of his documentation of the case. So that gave us a great starting point to actually do the set build. And then our production designer, Natalie O'Connor, was kind of on this search to really replicate things that were in the photographs that were taken at the time. We worked a bit with Janet and Margaret, the two girls who now women at the time were 12 and 14, were at the center of the case. They had some things still from the house, so the set has this weird combination, like the whole thing, of real things that were actually in the house and sort of replicas. And yeah, so our process was, obviously we had to cut these scenes out of the audio tape, before we built that space. And then when you're starting to try to put actors in there and work out how are people moving around this room, there must be someone there, or he must be there at that moment, but then they seem to be there at this moment, or someone's upstairs. It felt like the audio was starting to sort of tell you how it needed to be blocked around that space. And then we also used the set as a way of sort of taking people back into that memory. So there's a point where the photographer enters the space and he uses the space to describe what happened. I mean, actually, in a way, I feel like looking at it now, I'd have liked to have done that more. There were sort of practical reasons why that was difficult. So it was both a prompt for our interviewees, our contributors, and also a place where you could unfold the story through the tapes.
Yeah, it's the results is that it is both creepy but also very lived in and very accessible, I guess. It does feel like we're moving through this house through the power of these actual audio tapes and watching, the actors perform. I'm curious, when you're telling a story, as much as you might try to be objective, your own opinions and subjectivity comes through. What kind of insight did you glean about this family, about Maurice Gross, about Graham Morris, the photographer of the infamous photo of Janet? What kind of insight were you gleaning about these people, and what was sort of your ultimate takeaway about what happened?
I think when you start on a project like this, it's like, oh, Poltergeist, that sounds fun, kind of thing, And of course, like often, as soon as you talk to, the real people involved in this situation, you kind of realize that it's full of, deep sort of emotion and maybe even trauma. And you're kind of dealing with a very different thing. My I certainly I didn't come away with the sense that this had been an invented an invented kind of project of the children or the family. It's kind of, it unfolded over an 18-month period. There's plenty of times in the tapes where it feels completely out of control, out of their control. That's not to say that kids don't play around, and I think kids in a war zone play at war, and that doesn't mean the war isn't happening. So I don't think that helps us. And in a way, for me, it's like, it's almost less interesting whether the poltergeist exists or not. I'm kind of interested in, why do people come to believe in it or even need it? And that's not to say that the poltergeist doesn't exist. I'm just quite open-minded about that, I think. So in the I think one conclusion I came to, that Maurice's attempt, which is an honorable one, I think, to try and find evidence for this, I sort of feel in some ways is a doomed attempt, because it's not for nothing that these phenomena are called the unknown. It feels like they're of a different order, somewhere between mind and matter, and that you can't measure a ghost. So that I think is kind of, but that's not to say it doesn't have a reality. You know what I mean? So I think that's kind of where I ended up on it, and I'd certainly, absolutely kind of honor and respect the experience of those who were in the house, and at 45 years distance, it's in a way, I don't think we'll ever get closer than that testimony, than saying, well, do you believe them or don't you believe them?
Yeah, I know there was a lot of accusations throughout the years that maybe the girls were pulling some pranks or wanting attention, and honestly, that never quite felt like a complete, I guess, approximation was taking place. That maybe, yes, as you said, even people tell jokes, gallows humor in war zones, and maybe the girls even felt a pressure to deliver sometimes to this sort of father figure, adopted father figure of Maurice Gross. But still, to keep that up and to be delivering that for 2 years, 18 months, your takeaway is not that these girls, now women,
No.
were just faking all of this.
No, absolutely not. I mean, and if they were, God, at what cost? It's like the consequences for them were pretty awful. No, it just doesn't hang together as an idea. Yeah.
It's a bit of a pop culture elephant in the room these days, because of course the Conjuring 2, which became a big box office success, involved Ed and Lorraine Warren and their accounts of being involved with this. I think, can you put that to rest based on your interviews, how involved they were, based on what the sisters and Graham Morris, what their kind of thought was?
Yeah, I mean, I've tried to avoid kind of watching as soon as I got involved in this, avoid watching other representations of the story, in case I was influenced. I actually haven't seen The Conjuring 2. I will watch it now, once we're through this, release. But yeah, they came to the house, I think, on 3 occasions. Twice on, I think they stayed one night. There's a couple of tape recordings of them there. It was very late in the process, like maybe mid 78, I think I'm right in saying, or possibly 79. I could tell you that if I looked it up, but yeah, it was pretty peripheral. Maurice was there 3 or 4 nights a week for a year at least. So I would say that their involvement was slight. And most of the tape recordings are Lorraine Warren on the phone to the National Enquirer trying to sell the stories.
Do you think that Maurice Gross was involved and spending so much time with this family, even, there's this thought that maybe he even kind of funded or helped to fund this vacation, this holiday for them, for the family to get away for a week. Do you think that this involvement was purely research and investigative focused, or did he become truly attached to this family and to these sisters, well, and the son?
I think I think Maurice started out, perhaps as we did with the series. It's like, oh, it's a poltergeist. I want to go and get to the bottom of that. And then, fairly soon, I think he realized, and I think this changed also the way he investigated other things later. That you can't investigate a poltergeist without supporting and involving the people who are experiencing it. And he became, I think he did become very supportive of the family. It's a kind of dual-edged sword. His interest did bring in all of those other people that were interested, not that he even wanted them there, but the consequence of, this being in the newspapers and on television was that, people would come visit the house, ranging from physicists to ghost hunters to priests to, mediums to neighbors. And, in a way, the series is as much about the impact of that on the family as it is about the impact of the events themselves. But I think I think Maurice was good-hearted, well-intentioned. I think he did get close to the family, and as Janet says in the series, he continued to visit them kind of long after the events had stopped.
There's theories that when you start telling stories, even the dramatizations of true stories of hauntings and whatnot, you might stir up activity. It's a theory. And then when you're talking about, as you said, bringing items that the sisters owned onto set, I am curious about strange happenings that occurred on set. And it is Halloween here in the States, and I guess in the UK, you guys have been infected by our Halloween bug. But anything strange that took place on set that really made you think, beyond the pale, this is odd?
I think you kind of, you get orientated towards these things. And, some would say, well, you're just noticing, these patterns that exist in the world. And others would say, well, it's just coincidence. And you're kind of cognitively recognizing a pattern that isn't there. But it's certainly a lot of weird stuff with dates and numbers. And then I think I've sort of told the story before, but there was this strange incident where we were chasing down a typewriter. Maurice had used one of the really early IBM Selector typewriters, and we wanted to get his typewriter because the typewriter and the notes that he takes is quite important in it. And we'd gone on eBay and we'd found a couple and they hadn't worked, and then finally we found one that the guy who was selling it said it worked. And we got it into the art department, plugged it up, and at the time the series was called The Happenings, was our working title. And the person in the art department typed out The Happenings, and when they hit the S, there was a kind of bang, and the typewriter caught fire and never worked again. So that completely freaked them out, I think. I think but these as you say, these things happen when you start putting your attention that way.
The old saying that everyone's a critic, I guess it extends to potential specters. Didn't care for the working title, The Happenings.
Exactly.
And the I won't keep you for too much longer, but for you, when you wrap up a story like this and you've become so invested, and again, listening to hundreds of hours of tapes and then speaking to the people, do you, as a documentarian, do you just wrap up that story and wrap up that interaction with people and then you move on? Or is there something that still lingers with you from telling this story and other stories that you've told?
Yeah, I mean, I usually end up staying in touch with the people who've been in my films in some form, and often that kind of diminishes over the years. But I think you have a responsibility beyond the film itself. It's not like you go in, you film something, and you leave, and that's it. So that's important, I think. Usually, what happens after a series like this is, you'll get offered the Enfield Poltergeist 2 or whatever, the Carlisle Poltergeist, and for me, one of the joys of documentary making and the privileges of it is that you can do this deep dive, often over a couple of years, into a sort of subject area, and you talk to people who are the kind of world's experts in it and people who have direct experience of it. And then it feels like when I've kind of finished, what I want to do is to explore something else as opposed to explore the same thing, partly because it's got a kind of certain completeness to it in the way that we've looked at it, and it feels time to move on. So you move on from the subject, but not from the people.
Do you believe in the authenticity of Graham Morris's photograph of Janet Hodgson seemingly levitating from the bed?
Well, it depends what you mean by authenticity. I mean, it's a photograph. He took it. It's not. It's he wasn't in the room. How can you? It's an image. You have to. I don't think you can come down either way because you don't know what happened in the 20 seconds before that photograph was taken.
Do you think she jumped?
I just couldn't say. I couldn't say. There's multiple photos. Some of them are pretty weird. Some of them look like jumping. Some of them, you think, as he says at the time when he's got that neg strip, which unfortunately we couldn't get hold of again, I think, because the BBC never returned it to him. But there's that bit of archive of him with the neg strip showing the BBC, and he's talking about how his remote shutter goes a sixth of a second, and how Janet goes from prone in the bed to upright within a sixth of a second, and the physical impossibility of that. So yeah, strange and inconclusive.
Yeah. And I don't know, obviously I wasn't there, but I actually think with this docuseries, obviously we'd seen the photo before, but with this docuseries, it almost makes it more compelling to me because you see how narrow that area is, and it's not like they have massive cathedral ceilings for a child to be jumping off a bed in the middle of the night in the darkness. It just seems impossible, no, but it seems awfully strange for that to have taken place. But
exactly. Yeah.
but you spent more time in the recreation of the house, so you would know.
And you have her statement after, I'm not sure it's that particular incident, but after one of those flying out of the bed moments where what she describes, and I sort of feel she describes it credibly, as being dragged, being pulled out of the bed. So yeah.
Well, and just kind of going back to the fact that you have actors lip syncing to actual audio, as a documentarian, and you're presenting, yes, you are telling a story, but you're also presenting kind of the story, I guess, as much as you can. When you're also directing actors and directing the expressions of actors to align with these tapes, is there a challenge as a documentarian where you run the risk of kind of editorializing or becoming too involved because you are directing the expressions?
Yeah, I think you have to beware of like over interpreting things, and over signaling them. I mean, for the actors working, because I think people have done actuality where it's just interviews before, but sorry, I'm lip syncing where it's just interviews. But the difference with this is it's kind of actuality. It's just life unfolding onto the tape. And one of the things you're depriving an actor of is the way of delivering a line, that sort of basic thing in acting. So I think for the actors, it was very much a case of trying to sort of get from the line back to the person, or from the sound back to the person. So I think a lot of what you see there is how the actors, having spent time with the sounds and voice and kind of words of that character, you've got their interpretation. But I think certainly there were times where I would ask them to pull back on an something that felt like it was pushing a way of thinking about that line for an audience too far.
Why do you think that now, nearly 46 years after the incidents first began, why is this a story that continues to captivate people in England, as well as becoming one of the most famous modern day hauntings? Why?
I think,
and why now, I guess?
I think at the time, because it was happening in a very ordinary house in an ordinary street, and it could have been anyone. It wasn't a ghost story in a country house or with a headless knight or something in a castle. It wasn't remote like that. And I think the fact that it had witnesses who were socially credible, police officers, scientists, heads of university physics departments, well-known, an inventor. I think all that is what makes it compelling, that testimony, as well as the testimony of the family, who have no real interest in making up a poltergeist. Why now? Because I think horror kind of, and I'm not even sure I would classify this as horror, but the uncanny comes to the surface when I think at times when the world is unstable and we're full of fears, and it's a way of us kind of processing our fears and anxieties in perhaps through a story, through the screen, in a safe kind of way. That would be my take on it. And I think the 70s were a similar period. There was this flowering of films like The Exorcist and Carrie, and later on The Shining, that kind of spoke to that quite unstable world at the time. And I feel like we're in a similar period.
Yeah, you touch on it right in the beginning, the first episode, of the kind of the socioeconomic issues that are taking place in the world, and the fact that people can't really even necessarily afford to go on holiday. I think what makes this so relevant, this story now, is that it is set in a working class family. They can't just up and move because they have a ghost or a haunting or whatever. They're stuck there, and outside things are unstable, and inside things feel unstable. And the haunting comes home.
Yeah, I think that's right. They're sort of trapped by their economic circumstances there, and the thing they have is that their community. They're near to their relatives, they're near to their neighbors. To move would have been really inconceivable to them, I think. They ended up staying in the house for another 16 years.
I desperately have to let you go, but I do have to ask, are you going to see the Catherine Tate stage production of the Enfield haunting when that opens next year?
Yeah, do you know what? I realized it opens before its West End run in our local town, so I'm going to the very first night. It should be great.
I definitely want to hear your response to it, having now documented this. And again, Jerry, this Apple Plus show, this docuseries, is just such an interesting take on the story. It's such a clever narrative, and for someone that thought he knew the story, you add so many more layers to this. It's a really nice piece of work. So I respect you and commend you on that.
Great, thanks, Aaron. Yeah.
And that was director Jerry Rothwell, director of the 4-part hybrid docuseries, The Enfield Poltergeist, available October 27 on Apple TV+. I really found this to be an inventive approach to this investigation, and a way to bring new life, reinvigorate this story that you think this story, but I would honestly say this introduces a lot of chapters, a lot of information that I was not aware of with the Enfield haunting. So I do recommend checking it out. Alrighty, I am Aaron Sagers, and that is it for me and this episode of Talking Strange. Until next time, be kind, stay spooky, and keep it weird.